The great thing about Fred is it's so many different things, and we honour and we celebrate so many different styles. We have seen a force of nature from the west coast of America. We're about to see a different style of force of nature from the United Kingdom. The one thing that I love about Britain is its pomposity in terms of we do titles better than anybody else in the world, possibly with the exception of Russia because they have Grand Dukes. Professor Sheila, the Baroness Hollins of Wimbledon and Glenoside is a fabulous title, but actually she's Sheila. She's somebody that I've got to know over the last 4 years. My college and her charity work very closely together. And over the next 45 minutes, we want to tell her story and show why she's actually changing the lives of many people and is a true hero in the Fred tradition. So I'd like to invite Sheila to join us. Actually, I'll be the one blinded. Yes. You can have the one that's not.
Thank you.
We've got some slides in the background, but actually it's part of the narrative and part of Sheila's narrative. Sheila, one thing I've learned from you is that family is essential. It's essential to who you are, who you've become. And I think that's something if you share with the audience, particularly you're growing up, but then your children growing up, and how that's been the person you become.
Well, the reason I'm of Wimbledon and Glenoside is because when you become a member of the House of Lords, and I'm independent, I'm not hereditary, I was appointed for my expertise to help scrutinise legislation, okay? How did I come to be there? And actually, when I was offered the chance of choosing my title, I said I wanted to be of Wimbledon and Glenoside. Wimbledon because I was born there, and it was because my mother was born there, and it was just a very important place. Both my parents were dead by the time I went into the House of Lords. And Glenoside because at the age of 2, we moved to Glenoside, which is in Yorkshire, because my father was disabled during the war. And so as a disabled war veteran, he couldn't continue his career in London as a lawyer. He had a secure job in local government. But I learnt to go with him to the polling stations to help count the votes. Okay? And when I passed my exams at the age of 15, he took me to London for the day, and we went to the House of Parliament and met our MP and sat and listened to him ask a question. And I never really thought about politics as a career until I had kind of retired, and it was suggested that I could be useful. So there's a lot in between.
Well, I think that's one thing, and Sheila spoke at our annual awards ceremony a couple of years ago. And for somebody who has been the first woman to be president of the British Medical Association and the Royal College of Psychiatry, at the age of 8 you were told?
I didn't learn to read very easily, and my mother was told if she goes on the school pilgrimage to Lourdes, there might be a miracle. But it's a good thing that you've got blue eyes and blonde hair because you'll get by.
And that's...
Which I did.
The challenge for women still today, yeah, in terms of getting over the prejudices that women have a certain lot in school. But
and when I went to my interview at medical school, they said, what are you going to be in 10 years' time? And I said, I'll be happily married, probably working part-time as a GP with children. And they were very happy with that because at that time only 10% of women, they had a quota, it was a maximum quota of 10%. And they were really looking for good women to marry the men who didn't want to marry nurses. So I did become a GP, and I did have 4 children. My son also is a disabled man. And there's a picture of him when he was 6 years old, and at that age he had no speech, and he didn't really start putting words together until he was 8 or 9. And so we used to communicate with him in pictures, because pictures were what really helped him to kind of understand his world. He used to sit, we realised, because he would sit and listen to Laurel and Hardy, the silent movies, and he would laugh and really enjoy and really enjoy what he saw. So here he is, full of life, full of fun, but actually got very frustrated because he couldn't communicate with us, and pictures were the way for him. And it led on to the next slide, shows him as an adult, and he's actually here with Tina, who's one of the amazing staff at City Lit at Marks College. And they've been he's running a workshop, and he's actually teaching Tina how to read stories in pictures. And he was the inspiration for me to create picture books which explain difficult things to people who, like my son, really found pictures easier to understand than words. And the first picture book I did was called When Dad Died, and it was because I trained as a psychiatrist, and I decided to move into what was called in some places subnormality, in the United States mental retardation. We now call in the United Kingdom learning disability, but developmental intellectual disability and autism. This man, I was given a job in a long stay hospital, and I was asked to see a man who had no speech, but who was refusing food and refusing to get up, and nobody could understand why, and could I prescribe something for him, please? And I said I didn't know any medicine that would get somebody up, but maybe we could find out why and what had changed. And eventually it turned out that his dad used to visit every week, and they hadn't seen him for a while, but nobody had really thought much about it. And his dad had died, and this man was clearly grieving, but nobody thought a man without speech could grieve. And I couldn't find any way to explain to this man what had happened, because the funeral had come and gone. There was nothing, no ritual, no photographs. He had nothing of his father's, no mementos. So I made this book in pictures, When Dad Died, and made a film about it as well, which we called The Last Taboo, Mental Handicap and Death. And we've now got 50 pictures. But one of them, and I'll just show you very quickly so you get a flavour of what they're like. So this book, Mugged, was actually based on something that happened to my son. So yes, my son he was the victim of a disability hate crime. And this was before my daughter's injury. And so we decided to turn his story into this picture book, and I'll just show you a few of the pictures quickly. So my son actually was coming home because it was Mother's Day, and he was exploited by some young men, and they left him behind a wall, and he was in a pretty dreadful state of shock, and the story goes on. Our stories always have a challenge in them, but they also always have an intervention which leads to a resolution and some learning at the end of it. And so we for a long time, and I did this as part of my university work, so they were, if you like, a product of my research, because the When Dad Died story ended up being a research study which looked at how do people with intellectual developmental disabilities respond when they lose a parent? And what are the interventions that work? And so my research program then kind of dealt with these kinds of issues. But with each research project, whether it was about bereavement or improving access to healthcare or disclosing sexual abuse, for example, they always ended up with a picture book. So there would be a little research project and then a dissemination, a story, in order to be able to share that information with the people who are usually denied access to that information. Because this is a group of people who are not supposed to know, not allowed to know, not given access to information, assumed not to have a view, and if they are given information, they would be given digested information without the expectation that they would make anything of it. And so these stories, which were used to begin with just in therapeutic settings, I'm a psychodynamic psychotherapist as well, and as a psychiatrist, and I ran a group for people like this for 18 years, and people would come for 3 years or so, and then they'd be replaced by somebody, and the group continued. And we would read the books in the group as a way of helping them to tell their own stories. And when I retired, the university kind of said, well, we own the intellectual property for this. And they were quite happy for me to set up a spin-out company, but they wanted it to be a commercial enterprise. And we looked into all sorts of ways of trying to make it into a commercial enterprise, and they were sure that a publishing company would be interested. And there weren't any publishing companies that could see how they could make this into a commercial enterprise. So eventually they let me set it up as a not-for-profit, and that was 5 years ago. So we decided to not just concentrate on the healthcare setting, but to move on to thinking about people reading them in social settings. And so we moved on to looking to having book clubs. And we've now got, I think 60 libraries have got book clubs in the United Kingdom. And this is just people gathering, these are people, this book club had to divide into two because it got too big. But you can see they quite enjoyed it. But also the next slide shows two people just sharing. And it is, the libraries and these book clubs are providing a context to find my voice and to be heard. And that's to paraphrase something that Rocky said. And it's just so important because people, through joining together in this way and sharing their own story, through the story in the book, which through not having any words, actually allows you to tell your own story, your own interpretation. So there's one book, Sonia's Feeling Sad, for example. I know at least 4 versions of that story because you can make the story into the story that you see. It's not a story that somebody else is imposing on you. And so people share the story and they create the story. And it's just so empowering. And so they're beginning to develop a little kind of social hub, a peer group, who then start doing other things together. So one group, for example, went to the National Gallery and they had a guided tour, and the guide discussed the story in a famous work of art with them. And they knew how to read it because they know how to read pictures, because that's what they're good at, that's what they were doing. And they were able to have a wonderful time. Or a group that read a book called You're in Prison, who invited the local policeman to come and meet them and to talk to them so that they could ask some questions. And he then invited them to the police station so they could have a look and see what happens when somebody's arrested. And so on. And so you begin to see this development of a whole kind of...
I think it's interesting that at my college we partnered, Tina, who you saw the picture of earlier, with Nigel, was head of visual arts, and she was working with Sheila's team about getting the right types of illustrations. One of the first conversations I had with Sheila was the challenge faced of getting illustrators who don't make it look like children's comics or actually adult comics. You want it that somebody who can relate to. So we got the arts faculty together and sort of said, come up with some designers and some artists who can do it in the right way. But Tina absolutely got passion having met Sheila and started running teacher training classes, both for some potential facilitators in libraries, but my own college's staff started to go up to initially make up the numbers. But what was funny, because Sheila had the pull in the arts faculty, in the visual arts faculty, she was mostly visual artists. And the feedback we got, and this is the interesting kind of byproduct of what was happening, was our artists and our art teachers were starting to challenge the way that they taught, realizing the narrative around pictures was different than they had classically been taught as visual arts teachers. So it was a very interesting interplay, and it wasn't just, well, we'll help Beyond Words as a charity. Suddenly my arts teachers are going in droves to these classes because it's challenging their assumptions about their practice and starting to actually up their game. And from that point, you came up with quite an interesting idea about 18 months ago called the Mental Wealth Festival. Do you want to kind of talk to us about that a little bit?
Well, and it links actually to another part of your college, which is the progress courses and the courses for students with developmental disabilities, which have been run, if I can say, quite separately.
Yeah.
With, I think, the assumption that people with developmental disabilities would only really benefit from classes designed specially for them. And I think there's a beginning realization now that actually the staff, by becoming familiar with ways of communicating, ways of including, ways of kind of understanding, that could actually include our students as students in, these students as students in other classes, which I think is very exciting, but also potentially, and it's still to happen, but potentially as teachers in some other classes. Because if you're like my son, who still struggles quite a bit with language, but he's actually quite a passionate teacher, as long as he's got the right tools, because he can't read. And so he can teach quite a lot. If he is, and so the whole of our ethos had been about co-creation. So we had this idea that we could have, I'm a psychiatrist, okay, I go to lots of professional conferences of psychiatrists, and yes, we have a sort of carer and user involvement panel and so on. But what about if we had a mental wealth festival where it was open to everybody, and we could really sort of focus on what do we need to do in our lives to empower us and to help us to be well? Why not talk positively about mental wealth rather than just focus on mental illness? And so we put it together in about 2 months last summer. And we had, 400 registrants, and it was very exciting, very, very, exciting indeed.
It was especially exciting for Sheila because it was her idea. It was especially terrifying for my staff because it was the week before the start of term, so we were suddenly running 50 events. Everybody just piled into the college, and it was every sort of background, and what was brilliant was it gave a real vibrancy to a week that's all about registrations and enrollments and kind of getting things going. Suddenly there were people with all sorts of different aspects and approaches to life, some people who had specific challenges, some people who were just intrigued by it all. And so last year we kind of got proof of concept. This year, at the end of it, I rashly said, yeah, let's do it bigger and better next year. And Sheila, as some of you will possibly learn over the next few years, is if you give her half an open door, she'll come charmingly through it with great style. And she said, right, well, we'll do it bigger next year. So last week we hosted the second Mental Wealth Festival. We had Hugh Grant, who reoccurs in our story. We had Ruby Wax, we had Alistair Campbell, Tony Blair's former press secretary, talking about addiction and depression. We had Professor Paul Dolan from the London School of Economics on happiness by design. We had about 50 classes. We had 3 members of the House of Lords doing Tai Chi at 9 o'clock in the morning. And it was this wondrous, chaotic but fabulous event with all of these different things going on. And I love the fact that Sheila, I'm a great believer in the use of words and how important it is. If you'd have said it was a mental health festival, it would have had stigma. It would have gone to one particular audience, and part of what we are trying to do is say, actually, and we had a Conservative MP coming extolling the virtues of good mental health in the workplace and how it was important because the number one loss of days in Britain is now due to stress. And actually, it's not true because it's so much beyond that. Because people who are not going to work because of stress, half of them will hide it and say, my back's gone out, I've had food poisoning. And the reality is it's stress related. So what we're trying to do with this is normalize it. By saying mental wealth, you put a kind of positive spin on it. And it was kind of Sheila's touch of genius at the beginning, not to allow us to be pigeonholed as, oh bless, they need to be looked after over there and we'll deal with only that audience. We have the complete array of London society there.
We did, very diverse. We had a cardinal. We had a Benedictine monk and me talking about spirituality and mental health, which was interesting. We had a 19-year-old film student who, for his first year project, had made a 5-minute film about a woman blacksmith who had a bipolar disorder. And I chaired this session. I mean, it was just brilliant. He'd got no previous knowledge or experience of mental illness or mental health, and he managed to make this wonderful film. And she came along and spoke about it as well. And there were at least 6 people in the room who also had a bipolar, who talked about it during the session. So we were kind of bringing together professionals and people who were themselves experiencing it to explore and understand. And I think that one of the most important things that we have to do is to get people to talk about their mental health, but also to take some responsibility for their own recovery and for keeping well. And so that's kind of a theme. But we ran workshops on how to read picture books as well. So we did that too. Just as a reminder, because we have an app now, and it's only very recently been published, and it's free. But if you actually want to have our entire bookshelf of 50 books, you have to pay a subscription. But that just tells you a little bit about where we're at. But we decided, because our vision, you see, is actually these pictures, because they don't have any words with them, they actually work anywhere in the world. So I've used them in China and in Sri Lanka and in South Africa and West Africa and India and, well, I mean, I know they work, and it's extraordinary that they work. And there's one very little story that I arrived in India, and I was visiting a community where people with intellectual disabilities are living. And one of the staff there said to me, this man, his mum died, and we don't know what to do because he's very distressed, and we don't know how to talk to him about it. And I said, I've got this book I've got this book with me. But he doesn't speak English. Doesn't matter. I will sit and read it to him anyway. So I sat and I read the book to him. And this one's actually when Dad died. It was his mum. But I had when Mum died with me because I've got one. And I sat and read it to him. And I spoke to him just very gently in English to encourage him. And he spoke to me in Hindi, okay? And he cried in the places that people usually cry. But he also smiled when we got to the end of the story. And he held the book to himself, clearly wanting to keep it. So I gave it to him. And he was just thrilled. And the staff said, how did you do that? Okay. I didn't. The pictures did it. Because actually, I gave him something. I gave him something which has feeling in it. It's not just information. It's about relationship and emotion. It's actually about real life. It's about how we live our lives, how we understand our lives. And we're trying to do that in a story format. So it's a storytelling tool. So that's that. So you can see them later if you like.
Medical professional, top of your field in the medical profession, founded charities, conferences. In recent years, you talked briefly about going into Parliament, and I want to kind of tie that in with, you kind of threw in that we just had a random cardinal pop into the Mental Wealth Festival last week. You've also, and this is something that's kind of interesting as you get to know Sheila, is last year, it really wasn't convenient to have the Mental Wealth Festival in the week that we had it. And I'm trying to persuade Sheila to move it the week before because it's a bit easy. And she keeps on kind of coyly saying, I've got something else on. And I'm quite stubborn, so I decided I need to know what it is. And as you said, well, it's a thing. It's a thing. And I'm going, no, Sheila, because I've got like 30,000 students enrolling the week after. She goes, well, I'm having breakfast with the Pope. And right at that point, I backed off. And she goes, well, I don't only do it twice a year, which is twice a year more than I think everybody in the room put together has. But Sheila has also been appointed to the Pontifical Commission on the Protection of Minors. And I think if you want to just speak as we kind of wrap up, about your role both as a legislator and also on that role through faith would be very interesting, I think, for everybody to hear a little bit about.
Okay, well, just about the time I was appointed to the House of Lords in 2010, I also, and there I speak about mental health, I speak about disability, I particularly speak about the inequalities in both health and social care and inequalities in society. And it's very interesting to see how often a bill will come to the House of Lords for us to scrutinise, where when I look at it, I think this group of people who I'm concerned about are going to be really seriously disadvantaged by this legislation if it goes through unamended. And so I will be trying to amend that legislation, and I'll be looking to see who's going to help me to do it. And there are times when you think I can't do anything about that, and there are other times when it seems like I can do something about it. So there's one which I'll give as an example, and we had this huge health and social care bill which has really been disastrous for the National Health Service. I mean, it really has. It's been very, very difficult. But when I looked at it, it was very clear we weren't going to be able to stop it going through but it talked about health and illness. It didn't specify, it didn't mention mental health or mental illness anywhere. And I managed to get changed in Clause 1A and Clause 1B of the bill. I managed to get it to say, instead of health and illness, it said mental and physical health and mental and physical illness. And it took an awful lot of work. I mean, so much work you wouldn't believe, and debates in order to achieve that. But it led to what is now known as parity of esteem, and it's actually leading to a change in the way in which these services are funded, because mental health services have always been kind of the Cinderella, the poor relation of other services. And it is leading to a change both in that and in the percentage of money which is being given to research. So that's kind of really important. But about that time, the Cardinal who came to the Mental Health Festival, who I know because when my daughter Abigail was first admitted to hospital, he came to see her in hospital. And so we know him. And he rang me up and he said he'd been asked by the Vatican to go to Ireland to look into the way in which the Irish bishops had so badly mishandled the clerical sexual abuse scandal. And he said, I can't do that unless I have somebody who has the competencies as a psychiatrist, as you do, but also is a woman, because I would have no credibility at all to go there without a lay person, a lay woman, and somebody who knows how to listen. So I went with him. And we spent 3 weeks in Ireland, and there were in fact 4 of us together for that 3-week period. We worked extremely hard. We listened to hundreds of people from all sections and held public meetings, and, you know, basically I helped him to write his report. And then after that, I got asked to go to Rome to speak at a conference of bishops from all over the world. And they'd asked me to go and to speak about the impact on victims of abuse. And I said no, I couldn't come unless I could take a survivor with me. And they thought it would be very difficult for a survivor of clerical abuse to go to Rome and to speak to 200 bishops. But in the end, they agreed and gave me the task of finding somebody and preparing a joint presentation, which I did. And we were the only lay people, the only women, but actually we had the most impact on the bishops. And then after that, Pope Francis decided to set up a commission to advise him on how to help the church to deal with this terrible thing that had happened in the church, and to change the way that priests and religious are trained, and to try to create an environment in which children would be safe. And so that's what the Pontifical Commission does, and that's what we're trying to do.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think you can understand why Sheila is one of my personal heroes, but I think justifiably has the award of being one of Fred's heroes. So ladies and gentlemen, Sheila Hollins. I think we have probably about 5 minutes for questions. If anybody would like to ask lots of little questions, or in the David Batstone tradition, one very long one. Richard.
There are 2/3 of all people who ever lived past 65 are alive today. 10,000 people a day in the U.S. turn 65, looking for a way to connect with generatively or positively with these kinds of issues. Any response to how to connect this colossal resource with these kinds of challenges in positive ways? The UK, I'm sure, has the same exact.
Yeah. I mean, you know, the library book clubs are a really good way of. The reason we chose libraries, because there are healthy living groups, there are hospital therapy groups, all those kinds of things. But the reason I think a library book club, for people who would normally not go to a library because they can't read, so why would you go to a library? And perhaps actually the fact that you don't read or you struggle with words may mean that the notion of going to a centre of learning is kind of a bit, right? But to be able to go, and librarians don't have time, they need volunteers. And I would have thought that 65 plus army of volunteers could so easily do a half-day workshop and learn how to do this and become the friends of so many people who, I mean, the experience of facilitating a group of 6 or 8 people in this kind of way, the reward from it is just huge, absolutely huge.